The serving platter hit the hardwood and broke clean in half, and still nobody at that table understood what they'd just woken up. I was the one who'd carried it in from the kitchen. Walt's good white platter, the one with the chipped rim, loaded with the brisket, Dale's wife had spent all afternoon arguing was overdone. It slipped, or my hands let it slip. I honestly don't know which anymore. What I know is the sound. That hard, flat crack against the floor of the house on South Boot Street, and then the kind of quiet that isn't quiet at all. It's a room holding its breath. My name is Inez Sayers. I am 58 years old. For 17 years, this family had decided that the most interesting thing about me was that I'd married up, and the least interesting thing was that I'd spent 22 years flying medevac helicopters into places they'd never let themselves imagine. Before the coffee went cold that night, every laughing face in that dining room would be on its feet, and the man who'd just mocked me, my husband's own brother, would learn that his commander, sitting 3 chairs down with a fork halfway to his mouth, had been waiting his whole career to shake my hand. But I'm getting ahead of it. Let me go back to before the platter fell. Let me go back to the part where they were still laughing. It was the 3rd Sunday in March, the night the Sayers family gathered every year to honor Walt. Walt Sayers had been dead 4 years by then, and we still set his place. Vietnam Dustoff pilot, 2 tours, the kind of man who didn't talk about it and didn't have to. He'd built the brick bungalow on South Boots himself, board by board, back when Marion still had factories running 3 shifts. Out past the gravel drive, at the edge of the lot, there was a detached shed he called the hangar. Nobody had opened it in years. The padlock had gone orange with rust, and I used to catch Walt standing out by it in the evenings, hands in his pockets, just looking, like a man checking that something was still there. The Mississauga ran cold that March, past Matter Park swollen with the melt. 2 blocks over, the VFW post flag snapped in a wind that came straight down off the flat fields. Inside, the long table was set for 11, and I was at the foot of it where I always sat. The in-law seat. The seat closest to the kitchen door so I could get up and refill things without anyone having to slide their chair. I'd brought my coat in and hung it on the back of my chair instead of in the closet. I always did. In the right pocket, there was a coin, brass gone dark and smooth at the edges, that I'd carried so long I didn't feel it anymore. I'll get to the coin. For now, it just sat there in my pocket, the way it had sat in every pocket I'd owned for 30 years. Dale Sayers was holding court at the head of the table, in Walt's chair, which nobody had ever told him not to take. Dale was 46, a captain in the Army, stationed down at Knox, and he had the kind of voice that filled a room because he'd never once doubted the room wanted to be filled. He was talking about a promotion board coming up that summer. He'd been talking about it since Thanksgiving. The way Dale told it, the board was a formality, a coronation he was being made to wait for. "They'll see the record," he kept saying. "The record speaks." His wife, Carol, smiled and topped off his glass. Their 2 kids, both in high school, picked at the brisket. Dale's older sister, Brenda, who'd driven up from Indianapolis with her husband, made the appreciative noises a sister makes. And I sat at the foot of the table and listened, the way I always listened, with my whole face saying very little. Because I'd learned a long time ago that in this family, my words were furniture nobody had asked for. It was Carol who found the bag. She'd been digging in the front closet for a serving spoon, and instead she came out holding my old flight bag, a faded olive canvas thing I'd shoved in the back corner and forgotten. I hadn't carried it in years. I don't know why I'd never thrown it out. She held it up like she'd found a dead mouse. "Inez, is this yours? It's got a little tag on it." And Dale, who'd had 3 beers and an audience and a board on his mind, reached over and took it from her before I could stand. He turned it to the light. The tag was a strip of cracked leather, the lettering nearly worn off, but you could still read it if you knew what you were looking at. 2 words and a number. Dale read it out slow, performing, the way he did everything. Dustoff 6. He looked down the table at me and grinned. Dustoff 6. Well, look at that. I should tell you what those 2 words were. Dustoff was the call you put out when you needed a medevac bird, when somebody was hurt bad and the only thing left was to come pick them up and fly them out fast, usually into the exact place a sane person flies away from. And the number was the seat. 6 was the lead, the one who made the call to go in. I had been Dustoff 6 for the better part of 9 years, but Dale didn't know any of that, or he knew just enough to make it funny. He held the tag up so Brenda could see. "What did you fly, Inez? The coffee run." The table laughed, a little testing. He felt it land and he leaned into it. "Bake sale wings. Did they give you a little badge?" He looked at his son. "Your aunt was a pilot, son. Flew the brass to their meetings. Real combat stuff." "Dale," Carol said. But she was smiling too. "I'm just saying, some of us did the actual job." He set the bag down by his plate like it was his now. "No offense, sweetheart. You married a Sayers. That counts for something. But let's not act like we're the same. I want to be honest about what happened inside me. Because if I pretend I felt nothing, I'm lying to you, and I made a promise a long time ago to stop lying to keep the peace. What happened inside me was very small and very old. It was the feeling of becoming furniture again. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate. I squared it without thinking, the way you square a thing you've squared 10,000 times. And I said nothing. I had talked panicking men down off the radio while the ground came up to meet us. I had flown a bird that took 2 hits over a valley I won't name and brought 11 people home anyway, calm enough that the kid in the back later swore I'd sounded bored. Dale's little speech, with his beer and his board and his birthright, did not frighten me. I had heard louder men in quieter wars, so I let it sit. I picked the platter up to carry the brisket back to the kitchen, more to have something to do with my hands than anything, and that's when it slipped. That's the crack you heard at the start. That's the breath everyone held. And then the moment passed, the way those moments always had, and Brenda said, "Oh, the good platter." And Carol got up for the broom, and Dale was already on to the next thing, and I knelt down on Walt's floor and started picking up the pieces. Furniture again. I want you to understand how completely they'd all moved on by the time I was kneeling there. To them, the most dramatic thing that had happened all evening was a broken dish. I was still kneeling when the lawyer's name came up. It was Brenda's husband who said it, a soft little man named Gus who sold insurance and rarely talked. So, he said, "Careful. Did everybody get the letter from Pruitt?" The table changed. Quiet, but I felt it from the floor. Pruitt was Walt's lawyer, an old downtown man with an office on Washington Street that smelled like pipe smoke and carpet from 1974. After Walt died, there'd been a trust. Everyone knew there was a trust, and everyone knew it had never been read out, because Walt had left instructions that it not be settled until 4 years had passed. Nobody understood why 4 years. We'd all assumed it was grief, or taxes, or one of Walt's stubborn notions. 4 years was up that month. "Friday," Dale said. He said it flat, but his hand had stopped moving. "It signs Friday, Pruitt's office. We all go in, he reads it, we sign, it's done." "And it's split how?" Brenda asked. Dale looked at her, then around the table, and for just a second, kneeling down there with a chunk of broken china in my hand, I saw something flicker across my brother-in-law's face that I didn't have a word for yet. It looked almost like fear. It was gone fast. He covered it with a laugh. "It's the house, the land, Dad's accounts. It goes to blood, Brenda, to me and you. That's how Dad would have wanted it." He didn't look at me when he said blood. He made a point of not looking at me, which is its own kind of looking. "Friday we sign and we don't have to do this." He waved a hand at the room, the table, the broken plate, this whole thing, ever again. I stood up with the pieces of the platter cradled in my apron. I carried them to the kitchen. I ran the water and I let it run hot over my hands until they hurt. And I looked out the little window over the sink at the dark shape of the hangar shed at the back of the lot, the one nobody opened. And I thought about something Walt had said to me once near the end that I'd never told a soul. He'd been sitting in his chair by the front window with a blanket over his knees, and he'd been watching me the way he did, with those pale, steady pilot's eyes that didn't miss much. And out of nowhere, he'd said, "You know, Inez, the last bird out, belongs to her." I'd asked him, "The last bird out belongs to who?" And he'd just smiled, a little crooked, and looked back out the window at the shed, and never answered. I'd chalked it up to the medicine. He said a lot of things near the end that drifted. Brenda had heard him say it too, another time, and so had Carol, and we'd all just folded it into the quilt of strange last things old men say. The last bird out belongs to her. None of us asked her who. Standing at the sink that Friday was coming night, with Dale's voice carrying through the wall about blood and birthright, I didn't think it meant anything. I thought it was grief talking through a dead man. I dried my hands. I went back out and I refilled the coffee, and I sat back down at the foot of the table in the in-law seat, and I let them finish dividing up a house I'd helped Walt repaint, a man I'd loved like my own father even though I'd married into him. And I said nothing, because that was the deal I'd made with this family the year I came home from my last deployment to find they'd quietly decided my whole life had been a hobby. I'd let them decide that. That's the part I have to own. I'd folded myself down small to keep a piece that was never really mine to keep, and I'd done it for so long I'd half forgotten there'd ever been another version of me. I drove home that night down Washington Street, past Pruitt's dark office, past the VFW with its flag still snapping under the lot lights. And I want to be clear, because this is where the story actually starts. I had no plan. I wasn't going to fight anyone for anything. I was a tired woman with a brass coin in her coat pocket she didn't even feel, driving home to a quiet apartment, fully intending to show up Friday, sign whatever they put in front of me, and let the Sayers family close the book on Walt and on me both. I'd have done exactly that too, signed it and disappeared. If Odell Pace hadn't been waiting for me the next morning, with my old life sitting right there on the bar in front of him. Odell Pace ran a little repair shop off South Washington, a cinder block place with a hand-painted sign that just said mowers and a phone number 2 digits short of being legible. He'd put a coffee pot and 3 bar stools along the workbench so the old men of Marion would have somewhere to sit and lie to each other while he replaced their carburetors. I'd known Odell 30 years. He'd been the flight medic in the back of my bird more times than either of us could count, the one kneeling on the deck while I held us steady, the one who'd talked into his headset in that low, even voice that matched mine, note for note. We didn't see each other much anymore. That's how it goes. You share the worst hours of your life with a man, and then you settle 2 miles apart and wave at the grocery store. I went in that Saturday morning for no reason I'd have admitted to. Told myself I needed a new blade for the trimmer. The bell over the door rattled, and Odell looked up from a disassembled engine with grease to his elbows, and he didn't say good morning. He looked at my face the way you look at a gauge that's reading wrong. "Sit down, Inez," he said. I sat. He wiped his hands on a rag that did nothing, and he reached under the bench to a coffee can full of bolts, and he dug down past the bolts and came up with something he set on the workbench between us without a word. It was my coin, not the one in my coat pocket. I should be clear, because this is where I have to tell you about the coin, and there were 2, and that matters. The one in my pocket I'd carried so long I'd stopped feeling it. Brass gone dark, the unit number worn nearly smooth on the back. The one Odell set on the bench was its twin, his own, the one we'd all been given the day the unit stood down. He set it down hard, the way you set down a thing you mean to be heard, and it rang once against the steel. "You forget who you were," he said. "I don't." I looked at it. I didn't pick it up. "I heard about the dinner," he went on. "Marion is a small town, and the Sayers family is not quiet. I heard what Dale said about the tag, the coffee run." He said it flat. "No heat," which was worse than heat. You let him. "It isn't worth the fight, Odell. I didn't say fight." He pulled the second bar stool around with his foot and sat across from me. And for a second, he wasn't a man who fixed mowers. He was the man who'd ridden in the back of my aircraft into places that still woke him up at night. I said you let him decide what you were. There's a difference between holding your tongue because you're disciplined and holding it because you've started believing them. He tapped the bench once. Which one is it, 6? He called me 6. Nobody had called me that in 17 years. It went through me like cold water. I didn't have an answer for him, so he gave me something else instead. You go see Pruitt, he said. Before Friday, Walt came in here, must have been 5 years back, a year or two before he passed, sat right where you're sitting. He didn't buy anything either. A small smile. He asked me about you. Asked me what you were like, up there, when it got bad, and I told him the truth, that you were the steadiest hand I ever flew with, that you brought us home calm when calm was the last thing on earth that made sense. Odell's eyes had gone somewhere far off. Walt nodded like I'd confirmed something he already knew. Then he said a strange thing. He said, "Good." Then I picked right. And he got up and he left. Odell looked at me. I never knew what he meant. I think you ought to go find out before they sign it away. I drove to Pruitt's office Monday morning. I didn't call ahead. The office on Washington Street had not changed since the 70s, and neither, near as I could tell, had Pruitt. He was a narrow old man with reading glasses pushed up into white hair and an office that smelled exactly like I remembered. Pipe smoke soaked so deep into the carpet it had become part of the building. He knew who I was before I said it. He looked at me over the glasses for a long moment, and then he set down his pen and said, "I wondered if you'd come." I'd about given up hoping. "Hoping," I said. "Walt told me you might. He also told me you might not, that you'd gotten quiet, and that if you didn't come on your own, I wasn't to chase you." He folded his hands. "He was very particular, Mrs. Sayers. Your father-in-law was the most particular client I ever had, and I've buried a lot of particular men." I sat down across the desk in a leather chair worn shiny. Captain Sayers told the family it signs Friday. The house, the land, the accounts, split between him and Brenda. Blood, he said. Something passed across Pruitt's face, dry and a little amused and a little sad. "That is what Dale believes," he said. "That is what Dale has been told for 4 years, because that is what the preliminary letter said, and Dale has never once read past the first page of anything in his life." He took off the glasses. "The trust does not divide a sum, Mrs. Sayers. Walt did not leave money to be split. He left a stewardship. He named one person to hold the whole of it. The house, the land that shed out back, all of it in trust, to be used for a purpose he spelled out. And he named that person on the condition that they be present and willing on the settlement date." He paused. He did not name Dale. He did not name Brenda. I sat very still. I have been told my whole life that I have a flat face in a crisis, that nothing shows. I was grateful for it then. "Who did he name?" I said. "He named a steward," Pruitt said carefully, "and he left proof of his reasons in a form he insisted on. Not a letter. He didn't trust a letter, said anybody could claim an old man's signature was shaky." The lawyer's mouth tightened. He recorded his voice on a tape. He said the family would believe his voice when they wouldn't believe my paper. He left the tape with instructions about where it would be kept, and he told me, and I'm quoting the man, "It'll be sitting in plain sight the whole time, Hugh, right where none of them ever look." In plain sight. Right where none of them ever look. I thought about the mantel in the bungalow on South Boot Street. I thought about the row of things up there nobody had touched in 4 years. Walt's reading glasses, a folded flag in its triangle case, and a coffee tin, an old red one, taped shut along the lid, with a faded green stamp on the side I'd looked at 1,000 times and never once read, because it was just a thing on Walt's mantel and the dead-leaf things on mantels. A caduceus, the winged staff, the Dustoff emblem, stamped on the side of a sealed coffee tin, sitting on the mantel of a house full of people about to sign it out from under themselves. "There's a tape," I said slowly, "in the house. If it's where he told me, yes." Pruitt leaned forward, and for the first time, the dryness left him entirely. But Mrs. Sayers, you need to hear the rest, because Friday is closer than you think, and there is a problem. He drew a single sheet from a folder and turned it to face me. 2 weeks ago, Captain Sayers filed a preemptive objection through his own attorney. He got wind somehow that there was an audio recording bearing on the trust, and he filed to have it excluded in advance. He's claiming the recording is doctored, unverifiable. The voice of a sick old man, edited, coached, no way to prove what he understood when he said it. Pruitt's jaw worked. It's a thin filing, but it's filed. And if that tape surfaces Friday at the table, with no authentication, his lawyer can argue it's worthless, and the preliminary split stands by default, and it goes to blood after all. I looked at the sheet. I didn't really read it. I was doing a different kind of math, the kind I used to do in the air, the kind where you have a fixed amount of fuel and a fixed amount of distance, and you find out very fast whether the two of them get along. So even if his voice still exists, I said, the question is whether anyone will be allowed to hear it before Friday closes the book. That, said Pruitt, is exactly the question. I drove back across town with my hands steady on the wheel and something coming awake in my chest that I had spent 17 years putting to sleep. I passed Matter Park where the Mississauga ran high and brown and cold under the bridge. I passed the VFW, the flag still going, and I caught myself slowing down to look at it the way Walt used to look at the shed. I went home, but I didn't go inside. I sat in my car in the lot and I called Brenda, because the house on South Boots had passed to a kind of shared limbo after Walt died, with Dale holding the key and Brenda holding a key, and me holding the key Tom had left me that nobody had ever asked me to give back. I want to go sit in the house, I told Brenda, before Friday, just to be in it one more time before it changes hands. That part wasn't even a lie. Brenda, who had always been the kindest of them in the careless way of people who've never had to be brave, said, "Of course, honey, of course, you go sit as long as you like." I went that evening, when the light was going. I let myself in the side door. The house was cold and held that particular silence of a place where a strong man used to live and doesn't anymore. I didn't turn on many lights. I went straight to the mantel. The coffee tin was heavier than coffee. I knew it the second I lifted it. Something inside shifted with a soft, solid weight, and there was the faint metal and cardboard rattle of a thing on a spool. The tape along the lid had gone amber and brittle. The caduceus stamp up close was unmistakable. The same wings, the same staff, stamped or maybe pressed there by Walt's own hand. I held it and I thought about him standing at his window saying the last bird out belongs to her, and Brenda hearing it, and Carol hearing it, and all of us folding it into the soft cloth of an old man's wandering, and not one of us, not one, ever asking who. I knew who now. I think I'd known the moment Pruitt said, "in plain sight." I peeled the tape back slow so it wouldn't tear what was under it. Inside, nested in a nest of yellowed paper towel, was a reel of tape, brown ribbon on a metal spool, and a strip of masking tape across the flat of it with 2 words in Walt's blocky engineer's print, Dustoff 6. I sat down on the hearth with the reel in both hands. There was only one machine in the world that I knew of that could play it, and it wasn't in the house. Walt had cleared all that old gear out of the den years back when his hands got bad. There was only one place left it could be. Out past the gravel drive, at the dark edge of the lot, the detached shed he'd called the hangar, that nobody had opened in years, with a padlock gone orange with rust. I had a reel in my hands and no way to hear it, and 4 days, and a man across town who'd already filed to make sure I never would. You have probably already guessed what was waiting in that shed. You have not. The shed sat at the back corner of the lot where the gravel gave up and the grass took over, low and square, and the color of weathered bone, with a sliding door on a rusted track and a padlock the size of my fist, gone the deep orange of a thing left out in 17 Indiana winters. Walt had called it the hangar, the way a man calls a tabby cat a lion. Half a joke and half a thing he meant with his whole heart. There had never been an aircraft in it. There'd been a workbench and a wall of pegboard and the smell of two-stroke oil and cold metal. And for years, that was all any of us thought lived in there. The key was long gone. Tom had had one once, on the ring with the rest, but Tom was 4 years gone himself, and his keys had gone into a drawer. And then, somewhere along the way, into the soft forgetting that swallows, a dead man's small things. I stood in front of that door in the last of the light with the reel zipped into my coat against my ribs and the brass coin riding in my pocket where it always rode. And I did the arithmetic I'd been doing since Pruitt's office. 4 days. A locked filing in front of a judge, a door that had not opened in longer than that. And I thought about every Overwatch I'd ever flown, where the thing I needed was on the ground inside a perimeter that did not want me. And I thought, calmly, the way I think when the calm is the only fuel I've got left, that a lock is just a problem, and problems are just a series of smaller problems wearing a costume. I did not break it that night. I want to be honest about that because the temptation in telling a thing like this is to make yourself quick and sure, and I was neither. That night, I stood there until the cold got into my hands, and then I drove home and I lay awake doing the math over and over. And in the morning, I did the only sane thing, which was to go back to the man who'd told me to start. Odell didn't ask why I needed a bolt cutter. He listened to the half of it I gave him over the workbench coffee, and then he set down his cup and went to the back of the shop and came up with a 4-foot pair of red-handled cutters and a can of penetrating oil. And he said, "I'm coming with you." It wasn't an offer. I started to tell him it was Sayers' family business, and I watched it land wrong on his face before the words were even out, so I stopped. He'd ridden in the back of my aircraft into places nobody sane would go, and he'd done it because the people on the ground were his too. He wasn't going to sit in a cinder block shop and fix carburetors while I cut into the one building in Marion that might still hold Walt's voice. We went that evening. Odell soaked the shackle of the padlock in oil and waited, the way you wait, and then he set the jaws and leaned his whole weight in, and the lock gave with a small, dull sound, no drama to it at all, and the door slid back on its track with a shriek that sent something feathered up out of the eave and out into the dusk. The last bird out, I thought, and felt the hair come up on my arms. Inside, it was cold and close, and it smelled exactly like I knew it would. Odell found a pull chain, and a single bulb came on yellow and weak. And there it was, the whole of it, sitting under 4 years of dust like a held breath. The workbench, the pegboard, every tool still in its painted outline. And against the far wall on a steel typing table somebody had carried out here long ago, under a drop cloth gone stiff with grime, a squared-off shape I knew before I lifted the cloth, a reel-to-reel recorder, a real one, the kind with the 2 big silver hubs and the bank of square buttons and a meter under glass, its cord coiled neat as a sailor's rope beside it. Walt had not gotten rid of it when his hands went bad. He'd carried it out here, to the hangar, and covered it, and left it pointing at the door like it was waiting for somebody to walk in who'd know what it was for. "Lord?" Odell said quietly behind me. He kept it. There was more. On the shelf above the bench, in a row, were the logbooks. Not Walt's mower receipts. Flight logs, green canvas covers gone soft, the kind we all kept. His from a war 2 wars before mine, the dates in the 60s in that same blocky engineer's hand. I took one down and the spine cracked the way old things do, and the smell of it came up at me. Mildew and ink and time, hours and tail numbers and the shorthand of men flown out of bad places. He'd kept everyone, and tucked in among them, not hidden exactly, just kept, were other papers. And this is the part where the shed told me something I had not come looking for. There was a folder of receipts, and they were not Walt's. They were Odell's, medical bills, the long itemized kind. from the years after Odell's heart trouble started, the years I knew he'd had a thin stretch and had never once said how thin. And clipped to them were the records of who had paid them. Not insurance, not Odell. Walt Sayers had paid them, quietly, over 3 years. A man on a fixed income in a brick bungalow paying down another old soldier's debt and never saying a word to a living soul about it. Odell had gone very still beside me. I watched him read it over my shoulder, and I watched something move in his face that I will not describe in detail, because some things a man feels are his own. He put one greasy hand flat on the bench to steady himself. "I thought the hospital wrote it off," he said, and his voice wasn't even. "They told me it was forgiven. I sent a card to the hospital." He stopped. "I sent a thank you card to a hospital." He'd have liked that, I said, because it was true and because Odell needed somewhere to put it. There was one more thing in the folder, and it knocked the wind clean out of me. A photograph and a flyer for the regional air program over at the community airfield, and a girl's name written on the back of the photo in Walt's hand, and underneath the name, the word paid, and a date from 2 springs ago, the spring before he passed. A girl from Marion, 18, 19 in the picture, in a flight suit 2 sizes too eager for her, grinning next to a little trainer aircraft on the apron. And Walt's note, "She's got the hands. Keep her flying." I learned later her name was Carly Mott, and her people were from the north end of town, and there had never been a dime for flight hours in that house, and that a quiet old man had walked into the program office one afternoon and paid out a block of her training and asked them not to put his name on anything. She was still flying. She was flying because of him, and she had no idea whose money had kept her in the air. I stood in that cold shed, holding the evidence that the man I'd loved like a father had spent the last years of his life quietly carrying people, and I understood for the first time, all the way down, what he'd been doing when he rewrote that trust. He wasn't dividing a house. He was looking for the one hand at the table steady enough to keep doing it after he was gone. He'd been running a rescue his whole life, the kind you don't get a coin for, and he'd been looking for his relief on station. Odell carried the recorder to the car like it was made of eggshell. We set it up that night on my own kitchen table. The 2 of us, with the logbook stacked at one elbow and the curtains drawn for no reason I could name, except that some things you do in private. Neither of us had threaded a reel in 30 years. It comes back. Your hands remember what your head forgets. Odell read the path off the faded diagram on the lid, and I fed the brown ribbon off the supply hub, over the heads, through the little chrome guides, onto the empty take-up reel, and I turned it by hand a few times to seat it, and the whole time my fingers were doing it. I was somewhere else. I was 26 and threading a different kind of machine in a different kind of dark. I peeled Walt's masking tape off the flat of the reel so it wouldn't catch. Dustoff 6 in his block print. I set my thumb on the square ivory button that said play, and I looked at Odell, and Odell looked at me, and neither of us said anything because there wasn't anything, and I pressed it. For a long moment there was nothing but the hiss. That particular sound of a tape with no signal on it, the sound of a room from years ago breathing, and then under the hiss, faint, there was wind, not room sound. Wind and a low mechanical thrum way down at the bottom of it, and Odell's head came up sharp because he knew it too. That sound lived in both of us. The sound of a rotor at idle a little ways off. The sound of standing on an apron with a bird turning behind you. Walt had recorded the opening of it outside, on purpose, out by the airfield maybe. So the first thing on the tape would be the one sound that would tell people like us exactly what church we were in. Then a throat cleared. Close to the microphone, an old man's throat. That small, wet rasp I'd heard 100 times across a dinner table. And Walt's voice came up out of the hiss, steady, slower than in life but unmistakably him, every flat Indiana vowel of him, 4 years gone and sitting in my kitchen, plain as the salt shaker. "This is Walter Raymond Sayers," the voice said. "I flew Dustoff out of a place I won't name for the people who weren't there. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and Hugh Pruitt's done what I asked, and the families all sat down to carve me up." A dry sound that I realized, with a lurch, was Walt laughing. "Settle down. I'm getting to it." I had my hand pressed flat over my mouth. Odell was staring at the slow-turning reels like they might lift off the table. "I spent my whole life in the business of going and getting people when nobody else would," Walt said. "And I spent the last 10 years watching this family to see who had it in them to keep doing that after I quit. Not the loud kind of having it. The other kind. The kind that don't tell you they have it." The wind hissed under his voice. "I found it in exactly one person at my table, and it wasn't who shares my name." The reels turned. I did not move. I did not breathe. "The bird goes to Dustoff 6, Walt said, and his voice did something then. It firmed up and steadied the way a man's voice does when he's saying the one true sentence he drove all the way out to a cold airfield to say. The house, the land, that shed she's probably standing in, all of it. It goes to Inez. I had been told my whole life that nothing shows on my face. Something showed then." Odell reached over without looking and pressed stop, gently, his hand not quite steady, because he understood before I did that I needed it to stop for a second, that a person can only take the first half of a thing like that before they have to set it down and remember how to stand up under it. We sat there in my quiet kitchen with the reels stilled and the old man's voice hanging in the air, and it was Odell, finally, who reached out and turned the take-up reel a half-inch with one finger and frowned and looked closer at the supply side, where the tape still on the feed hub was thinner than it should have been for all that Walt had clearly recorded. "Inez," he said slowly, "there's more on here. He's not done." He turned the reel another inch and peered at the core, and then he went still in a different way. There, wound deep on the hub under the first tape, almost out of sight, was a second strip of masking tape stuck to the leader of another length of reel entirely, spliced on to play after the first ran out. A second recording, queued up to follow the first, that Walt had hidden behind his own will. Odell read the block print off it and looked up at me, and his face had gone careful, the way a medic's face goes careful when the thing on the litter is not what the radio said it would be. The single word on the second strip of tape was a name. It said Dale. I did not play the Dale reel that night. I want to be straight about why, because the easy version of this would have me tearing into it in the dark, hungry to know what a dead man had to say about the living one who was trying to take everything. But I had been a long time learning that you do not open a thing you cannot close, not at midnight, not with your hands shaking and a fight 4 days out. So I lifted the recorder off my kitchen table, and Odell helped me wrap it in a moving blanket, and we set it in the back of my car like it was a person we were driving somewhere, and I drove it across town to the one place nobody would think to look for it, and the one man I could trust to keep it sealed until Friday. Hugh Pruitt met me at the door of his office in a cardigan with his reading glasses pushed up into the gray of his hair, and he did not say a word about the hour. He just stood aside and let me carry it in. He listened to all of it then, the whole thing. The shed and the logs and Odell's medical bills and the girl from the North End with the borrowed flight suit and Walt's voice coming up out of the hiss to name me. And when I was done, he took off the glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. And he told me the part I'd been dreading, which was that Dale had not been idle either. Dale's lawyer had filed a motion 3 days back to have any audio recording entered in the matter declared, and Pruitt read it off the page in a flat voice so I'd hear exactly how it was built, doctored, unverifiable, the product of a grieving relative and a borrowed machine. He hasn't heard it, Pruitt said. He doesn't know what's on it. But he knew Walt well enough to be afraid there was something, and he moved to make sure that if it ever surfaced, no judge would let it count. He set the motion down, which means the question isn't whether your father-in-law's voice still exists, Inez. It does, The question is whether anybody with standing gets to hear it before the trust signs Friday night, with witnesses who can't be waved off as family. I sat in that quiet office and I understood the shape of the thing I was in. Dale had not just tried to take a house. He had tried to take the proof, to get out ahead of his own father's voice and brick it up before it could speak. And I thought, sitting there, about every time I had ever been talked down to at that long table on South Boot Street, every hobby and every sweetheart, and every time somebody had explained my own life back to me slower so I'd be sure to follow, and I felt something settle in me that was not anger. It was colder and more useful than anger. It was the thing that used to come over me when the radio was screaming and the gauges were wrong and somebody had to fly the aircraft anyway. I asked Pruitt who, by law, was allowed to be in the room Friday. He told me. And then I asked him whether the dinner was still Dale's to host, and he almost smiled because we both already knew the answer. And we both already knew who Dale, in his certainty, in his need to look like a man on his way up, had invited to sit at that table and watch him inherit. Dale had invited his commander. Her name was Colonel Renata Vargas, and Dale had been courting her for months the way a man courts the officer who holds his next rank in her hands. And a memorial dinner where he stood to inherit his war hero father's estate was exactly the stage he wanted her to see him on. He told the family she was coming as if it were a gift to all of us. He had no idea what he'd done. He had carried the one witness in the state of Indiana who could not be dismissed as kin, who would know in a heartbeat what she was hearing, straight into the room and sat her 3 chairs down from the machine that was going to say it. Friday came cold and clear, the Mississauga running low and dark past Matter Park, the post flag 2 blocks over snapping in a wind that smelled like a turn in the weather. The long table on South Boot Street was set the way Walt's wife had set it for 40 years. The good plates, the cloth napkins nobody liked to use. The family filed in, Dale at the head where he'd put himself in his service coat, polished, sure. Colonel Vargas 3 chairs down on the window side, straight-backed and watchful in a way Dale read as approval and I read as a person who notices everything. Pruitt at the foot with his folder, and me where they always seated me, near the end. The in-law, the one who married up, with my coat over the back of my chair and a worn brass coin riding in the pocket of it, the way it had ridden in every coat I'd owned since I was 24. Dale stood to speak before the food was even cold. He thanked everyone for honoring his father. He talked about blood and about service and about what it meant to be a son. And then, because he could not help himself, because somewhere under that polish a man was drowning in debt his own wife didn't know about and counting on this house to keep him from going under, he reached for the old joke one more time. He picked my flight bag up off the sideboard where I'd set it, and he found the tag, the faded one, Dustoff 6, in letters worn nearly to nothing, and he held it up for his commander to see, and he laughed. "You all remember Inez's little hobby," he said. "What was it, sweetheart, the coffee run? Bake sale wings." And 3 chairs down, Colonel Renata Vargas set down her water glass. I did not say anything. I had nothing to prove with my mouth, and I never had. I looked at Pruitt, and Pruitt looked at me. And he reached down and lifted the moving blanket off the recorder we had carried in before anyone arrived and set on the sideboard behind him, the 2 big silver hubs catching the light, and the table went quiet the way a table goes quiet when it doesn't yet know why. "Before anyone signs anything," Pruitt said, "Walt asked that this be played, all of it, in order." Dale came half out of his chair, his face working, the word doctored already in his mouth. But Vargas turned her head toward him with a single small motion, and he sat back down, because whatever rank means at a dinner table, it meant that. I pressed play, the hiss first, then the wind, and that low thrum way down at the bottom of it, the rotor turning on the apron, and I watched the colonel's chin come up an inch, because she knew that sound the way you know a voice in the dark. Then the throat cleared, that small wet rasp, and Walt's voice rose up out of the tape into his own dining room, 4 years gone. every flat vowel of him. This is Walter Raymond Sayers. I flew Dustoff out of a place I won't name for the people who weren't there. A pause. The wind. I spent my whole life going and getting people when nobody else would, and I spent 10 years watching this table to see who had it in them to keep doing that after I quit. The reels turned. Nobody at that table was breathing. The bird goes to Dustoff 6, the house, the land, the shed, it goes to Inez. Dale made a sound, but the tape wasn't done, because Walt had known his son, had known him all the way down, and the old man's voice firmed and turned and came forward off the ribbon to speak the words he'd driven out to a cold airfield to say. She carried my men home when I couldn't, Walt said. Now she carries this family. And Colonel Renata Vargas stood up. She did not stand the way you stand to object. She came up out of that chair the way a soldier comes up off the deck, smooth and total, and she turned to face me down the length of the table, and her hand came up sharp and flat to the line of her brow, and she held it there. She snapped to attention, and she held the salute, 3 chairs down from the man who'd called it a bake sale, and she did not lower her arm. I came up reading the Dustoff after actions, she said, and her voice was not quite level. Everybody in the medevac community knows that call sign. I have wanted to shake this pilot's hand my entire career. Captain Sayers, you brought your father's commander to this dinner. She let that land. You might have asked her who she was outranked by at her own table. Dale wanted a way out, and his pride handed him the worst one. It's hearsay, he said, hoarse. A tape. Anybody can claim a call sign. Do a coin check, right now. If she's who he says, she carries the coin. It was the oldest ritual we have, the thing you do to call a person's bluff. And he reached for it because in his whole life, nobody had ever called his and made it stick. Vargas looked at him with something close to pity. Captain, she said, you do not want to do that. But it was already moving, the whole table turning to me. And I stood, finally, and I took my coat off the back of my chair, and I reached into the pocket where it had ridden for 34 years, and I set the worn brass coin down on the cloth. Vargas crossed the room and picked it up and turned it to the light, and she read the unit number stamped into the brass, and she set it back down and looked at Dale, and she said the number aloud, the same number that was on the tape, the same number on the caduceus stamped into the lid of the tin that had sat on that mantel in plain sight the whole time, and the room understood all at once that the proof had never been hidden. It had been sitting 8 feet from where Dale ate his dinner every year, taped shut, waiting. That was the moment it broke open, and every laughing face from 100 dinners was on its feet, and Dale stayed in his chair with his hands flat on the cloth, a man who had drunk exactly what he'd poured. I could have let him drown. I want to be honest that the thought had a chair at the table too. Instead, I picked the coin back up and put it away, and I told the room what I was going to do, plainly in the only voice I have. The trust would stand, the house would stay a house, and it would fund a thing in Walt's name, flight hours for a Marion kid who'd never otherwise touch a stick, starting with one who was already flying on his quiet dime and didn't know it yet. And then I said the part I decided in Pruitt's office at midnight, that Dale's debt, the one his wife didn't know about, the one driving every cruel thing he'd ever said to me, would be quietly cleared, so his children kept their roof. I didn't say it to be large about it. I said it because Walt had spent his last years paying down other men's debts in the dark, and I had finally understood that was the inheritance, not the house. Dale put his face in his hands, and when he could speak, he said, low, that he would withdraw the filing, not as a deal, as a man stopping. So I played the last reel after the others had gone home, just Dale and Pruitt and me and the turning hubs. Dale, in Walt's block print. I won't give you all of what a father said to a son he knew would fail him before he forgave him, because some of it belongs to Dale, but it ended, you were always mine, even owing. Let her teach you how to carry it. Dale sat in his father's dining room and wept, and I let him, and that was the grace that I didn't watch. The Post chartered it within the month, the Inez Sayers flight scholarship, the paperwork pinned up on the corkboard by the door where the old after-actions hang. Colonel Vargas entered the recording into the family record herself, signed and dated, so no one could ever again call my father-in-law a doctored voice. Dale's filing came off the docket before his board ever convened. And there is a girl named Carly Mott who knows now whose money kept her in the air, and who showed up at the shed one morning before the sun because I asked her to. We slid the door back on its shrieking track into the gray light, and I threaded a fresh reel onto Walt's old machine, her hands following mine through the chrome guides, learning the path. Then I pressed the cold brass coin into her palm and folded her fingers over it. The rescue never retires.